Hi everyone, my name is Sophia Schwab, and this is going to be my real SIA critique that I'm taking out from the SIA Southwest Transmission Project Right-of-Way Amendment FEIS. So the purpose of this project is to increase available transfer capability of potential renewable energy generation, specifically in the southern area, and then to assist load-serving utilities in meeting the requirements to address energy delivery obligations and meet state renewable portfolio standards, and then finally to alleviate transmission congestion in southern New Mexico. So this project has actually been happening for a long time now. It originally started in 2013 with SIA Transmission being the applicant, but it was done through Southwest Power Group, who was overseeing the project, and they were starting the construction. They got halfway through the construction until a few complaints were made, and they had to stop the construction of the power lines or of this project. And after that, it was taken in control by a different company, which is Pattern Energy. And since they stopped the project, they had to do a new EIS, which was basically just an amendment of the right-of-way they already had, but this new right-of-way had some new adjustments to it just to accommodate for some complaints that were made with the last right-of-way they already had. So it is still under the agency of the Bureau of Land Management, and the amendment application for this new EIS was in 2021, and the final EIS was in 2023. Again, the purpose of this amendment was just to approve the locations outside of the original right-of-way due to those concerns that were raised. The specific concerns were from conservationists to there was a specific species of bird that lived in the area of where one of the power lines was going to go through, and then the government federal agency, there was an area that they believed could have come in contact with some of the buildings that they had. And so the scope of this project is to add two 500 kilovolt transmission lines, and it will cross federal, state, and private lands from New Mexico to Arizona. So this image shows the area that the power lines will cross through. It will cross 7 counties in New Mexico and 5 counties in Arizona. So the black line is previously approved by the BLM, and again, it just starts in Arizona and goes to New Mexico. They basically stopped the project in New Mexico or in Arizona, and most of the all of the new right-of-way is in New Mexico. And the pink shows the new right-of-way, which is addressed in this EIS. So the scope was basically created after it's based off this original scope from the 2013 FEIS, and then based off complaints and what they were seeing with that FEIS, they made some changes to create this new scope. And it was just reviewed. The last one was reviewed for adequacy, and then again just incorporated into this new EIS. And the scope was also made in cooperation with a bunch of cooperating agencies that they reached out to. And so it narrowed it down to 4 main components for this new scope. First component being the 40 new miles of localized route modifications in the Arizona and New Mexico, with those being there. Component 2 was access roads and temporary work areas outside of the current right-of-way. So the current right-of-way was the 2013 one. Again, in those areas in Arizona and New Mexico. Component 3 was the reroute of the 2015 selected route in New Mexico and those specific counties. And then component 4 was the new HVDC substation, which is called SIA West, at a newly identified West End receiving terminal in Pinal County, Arizona. So the public participation process was pretty extensive. I mean, they had the original from the 2013 project, so they had all of that to go off of already. And then just because the new group Pattern Energy felt that the last company didn't handle public participation as well, they really made it a huge effort to make sure to include a lot of public participation in this EIS. Start off, they had pre-notice of intent postcards that were mailed to the BLM's interested party list, and information of the project was posted online. They had 3 virtual public meetings that were hosted on those dates in 2021, and that was after the initial scoping period. They had project introduction letters that were sent to 29 tribes in December of 2020, and then they had the comment periods of 30 days and 90 days. This graphic, which is behind my head, and I'm not sure how to move my head, so that graphic is part of the newsletter that they would also send out after all of the important periods, such as the notice of intent with that 30-day scoping period during. And then after the draft EIS was posted, they did it. They basically did it after every important step. So that was just a way to help get the word out there. So I will say that even though, yes, they sent it out to the 29 tribes and they made sure to keep in contact with them after every single period, similar to this newsletter, only 5 out of the 29 tribes responded to them. So I think that considering that, it seems that they could have potentially used other measures to reach to those specific communities, such as potentially going in person instead and meeting with these different communities to help them better understand why they should take interest in these in this EIS, because sometimes a letter doesn't come off the same way. So I think that next time they could do in-person meetings with the communities. So after the scoping period and the initial commenting periods, they narrowed down to these purposes for the social impact assessment, which on the EIS is just as social and economic impacts, and then there's some other aspects in there that have their own environmental consequences. But specifically, they cover how many local jobs would be created from the construction and operations of the project of components 3 and 4, how many total jobs would be created from the construction operations of the project components of 3 and 4, what fiscal and economic impacts of the development, construction, and operation of project components 3 and 4 of the economies of New Mexico, Arizona, and the counties SIA would be located in. Would environmental justice populations be disproportionately affected by project components 3 and 4? And then what are the environmental justice differences between the route alternatives in segment 4 and the transmission line, which is the project component 3? So their SIA actually had no comparative analysis. There was no control community or comparative community. Instead, they evaluated social and economic impacts across the alternatives, and then they just compared the environmental justice findings from 2021 to the initial ones of 2013. And then because of this, I thought some ways they could improve was to just follow that control and comparative model. So they could potentially use evaluate impacts analysis from transmission line projects that parallels this line. There was 2 projects that parallel sections of this project, so they could find the impacts from those ones. And then choose a control community in rural New Mexico and rural Arizona. So those are just 2 ways they could have improved on this. So I'm not going to go into the predicted social impacts, but I would for sure argue that the impacts are reasonable, and there was a ton of data. I'll slide through a little bit of it after this slide, but there was a ton of data to go through it. Again, this has been going on for 10 years now, and 2 different companies have gone over it, so a lot of data to support it. I honestly don't believe that there was any missing impacts. I think that they identified most. And they also made it very clear that if anyone felt that there was impacts that weren't identified, that they could leave comments. So I do think that they did a pretty good job with predicting social impacts and having a follow-through option in case they miss any impacts. So yeah, I'm not really going to go into depth with the details of the data collection, but here's just a little bit of the data that they found just to show you the extents they went to. Again, but they were just showing the differences between the alternatives as a comparison. And then they also did an in-depth research on environmental justice and what specific communities might be marginalized groups. And they found 3 of them to be marginalized, and they just showed how they did that data there. And it was comparing again to what they found in 2013, and that was using census data. Again, it's really just a lot of reiteration, but here are the other what I believe would be components that would fall under SIA, but it wasn't under the social and economic section they had. They did look a lot at cultural properties and just tribal importance areas, so that was like a huge part of their data collection. They wanted to make sure that they got as much public participation from them as they could. But any additional impacts seemed a little unnecessary. I do believe that they hit most of the impacts, and they had many files just showing the extent of the data collection they had. So I'm not going to go through it, but here are the mitigation strategies that the EIS listed. And I will argue that they focus a lot of their attention on easement of anything related to cultural or tribal importance, especially like visual aspects or noise disturbance. They put a lot of their focus on that. I do think that they could have put a bit more focus on societal impacts with like housing. I don't really think, although they said it wasn't as big as an issue, I feel like they could have still put more focus on those potential impacts or just community impacts outside of tribal importance, even though, again, that's super important and most of the area does go through a lot of sacred land. I will say, yeah, there could have been a bit more community focus in those aspects. So here are the monitoring strategies that they provided in this EIS. In summary, they'll be issuing annual reports of the project status, cultural resource activities, and compliance progress, and the consulting parties can make any adjustments or recommend any adjustments to the pragmatic agreement. And then there's going to be constant monitoring and compliance through a BLM approved compliance inspection contractor, and if the contractor fails to comply, then they can issue a stop work order. And then finally, they must provide financial security to cover all post-field mitigation reclamation costs. So looking at these strategies, again, I really think they focus a lot, even though the bulleted point is summary, so it doesn't show it as much, but they focus a lot on the cultural resource activities monitoring, and they don't really show as much monitoring, say, with the environmental justice aspects, like seeing how that will shift. So maybe they could add in more monitoring to see how these projects can gradually affect the marginalized groups. So looking at the compliance with the SIA principles, I do think that as a whole, they hit every single principle. The only reason I'm giving them a 5 out of 6 is just like how in depth they hit the principles. They could have definitely gone a little more in depth, especially with reaching out to more people during the public participation and those aspects. But otherwise, I think that they hit all the impacts. Their data was sound, and they provided a lot of the quality information for decision making. And then they had a very in-depth environmental justice issue section. And they do have good mitigation plans, but again, the monitoring plans could be a little bit more in depth. So in conclusion, I would rate this EIS or this FEIS / the SIA as a B. Again, it was just, they could have done a bit more public participation. There was no comparative analysis, which could have really strengthened their expected impacts. But the social impacts were sound with good data, and mitigation and monitoring strategies were, for the most part, extensive. Thank you for watching.